Hello everybody, I'm Badfish, and today we're going to be looking at the life, career, and legacy of Julius Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. Specifically, we'll be focusing on his work with the Manhattan Project, his opinions on his creation, and the controversy around his security clearance. Before we begin though, I'd like to state that I'm obviously not a historian. I'm simply doing this because I enjoy talking about history. While I'd love to do a 3-hour-long deep dive into Oppenheimer's whole life, I'm only going to be touching on what I consider relevant. Robert's mother was a painter, and he also had a younger brother named Frank who would also grow up to be a renowned scientist. Robert grew up in New York and attended the Ethical Culture School, a private school founded to promote a form of ethical training based on the Ethical Culture Society. The Ethical Culture Society was a secular group that drew much of its teachings from Reform Judaism. It was very apparent that Robert was gifted from even a young age. He was especially interested in languages and would learn one quickly just so he could read a text in its original form. By the age of 10, Robert was delving into physics and chemistry. He completed the 3rd and 4th grades in 1 year and skipped half of the 8th grade. In 1921, he graduated high school as valedictorian of his class. During his undergraduate studies at Harvard University, Robert excelled in Latin, Greek, physics, and chemistry. He also published poetry and studied Eastern philosophy. After graduating in 1925, he realized his passion was in physics and traveled to Cambridge to begin studying under Nobel Prize winner J.J. Thomson. Robert later pursued a PhD in Germany for quantum physics under Max Born. While there, he was known for being too enthusiastic in discussion, sometimes to the point of taking over seminar sessions. This irritated some of Born's other students so much that his classmate Maria Koper presented Born with a petition signed by herself and others threatening a boycott of the class unless he made Robert quiet down. In 1927, he received his doctorate. I also want to mention that he apparently got to skip a chunk of college because he kept reading textbooks and professors couldn't keep up with him. I can't find an exact source on how much he got to skip in college, but at some point they just said fuck it and let him graduate. In 1929, Robert returned to the United States to teach physics at the University of California at Berkeley and California Institute of Technology. Robert's early research was devoted in particular to energy processes of subatomic particles, including electrons, positrons, and cosmic rays. He also did groundbreaking work on neutron stars and black holes. Since quantum theory had been proposed only a few years before, the university post provided him an excellent opportunity to devote his entire career to the exploration and development of its full significance. In addition, he trained a whole generation of U.S. physicists who were greatly affected by his qualities of leadership and intellectual independence. Robert was a tall, thin chain smoker who often neglected to eat during periods of intense thought and concentration. Many of his friends said he had self-destructive tendencies. Throughout his life, Robert was plagued by periods of depression, and he once told his brother, "I need physics more than friends." Robert's personal code was very complex and not dictated by a single religion or culture. He was Jewish by heritage but raised in a secular household. Much of his childhood was shaped by the previously mentioned Ethical Culture Society. I want to bring up a few things about his life that I feel like kinda help explain the type of person Robert was. First, a rather morbid story. Apparently, while attending summer camp as a child, Robert was stripped naked and had his downstairs mix-up painted before then being locked in a freezing shed all night. Apparently after this experience, he wrote to his parents telling them how happy he was to be at camp, and that his fellow campers were teaching him the facts of life. I mean, Jesus Christ, that's a fucking morbid outlook. During Robert's time studying in Europe, he went to meet up with his friend Francis Ferguson in Paris. Francis noticed that Robert was not well. To help distract him from his depression, Francis told Robert that he was to marry his girlfriend. Robert did not take this news well. He He jumped on Francis and tried to strangle him, although Francis easily fended him off due to Robert being a measly 135 pounds. Another noteworthy event is a story also recounted by Robert's friend Francis. Robert once confessed to Francis that he had left an apple dosed with toxic chemicals on his tutor Peter Blackett's desk. While Francis's account is the only detailed version of this event, it is believed Robert's parents had to donate to the school to keep him from getting in trouble. The whole point I'm trying to show here is that Robert was at times a deeply troubled man. Robert's diverse interests sometimes interrupted his focus on science. He liked things that were difficult, and since much of the scientific work appeared easy for him, he developed an interest in the mystical and the cryptic. In 1933, he learned Sanskrit and met the Indologist Arthur W. Ryder at Berkeley. He eventually read the Bhagavad-Gita and the Upanishads in the original Sanskrit. He later cited the Gita as one of the books that most shaped his philosophy on life. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany stirred his first interest in politics. Robert became deeply concerned with the rise of fascism in the 1930s, but his political activity did not reach much further than donations, occasional discussion groups, and benefits that he hosted. Many of Robert's closest associates were active in the Communist Party in the 1930s and 1940s, including his brother Frank, Frank's wife Jackie, his wife Kitty, his mistress Tatlock, his landlady Mary Ellen Washburn, and several of his graduate students at Berkeley. Honestly, I could add a dozen more things that made it seem like he was possibly a communist, but for the sake of keeping to the point, I won't. Also, since I just kinda skimmed over it, yeah, apparently Robert was a bit of a homewrecker. Debates over Robert's party membership or lack thereof have turned on very fine points. Almost all historians agree he had strong left-wing views during this time, and most definitely interacted with party members, though there is considerable dispute over whether he was officially a member of the party. Whether or not he really was isn't particularly important. It's just important to know that there was definitely a lot of stuff that made him appear to be a communist. After the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany in 1939, the physicist Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Eugene Wigner warned the U.S. government of the danger threatening all of humanity if the Nazis should be the first to make a nuclear bomb. Americans became worried that the Nazis could create devastatingly powerful nuclear weapons, and in response, President Roosevelt established the Manhattan Project, with which Robert was appointed its director. The Manhattan Project was a research and development undertaking during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapons. It was led by the United States with the support of the United Kingdom and Canada. Robert began to seek a process for the separation of uranium-235 from natural uranium, and to determine the critical mass of uranium required to make such a bomb. Robert was instructed to establish and administer a laboratory to carry out this assignment. He chose a mesa in New Mexico, which would go on to be called the Los Alamos Laboratory. The number of people involved in this project was truly massive. It had people contributing from all across the US, Britain, and Canada, along with a slew of universities around the United States. I'll show a list of the most notable people involved on screen. Robert initially had difficulty with the organizational division of large groups, but rapidly learned the art of large-scale administration after he took up permanent residence on the Mesa in Los Alamos. He was noted for his mastery of all scientific aspects of the project, and for his efforts to control the inevitable cultural conflicts between scientists and the military. He was an iconic figure to his fellow scientists, as much a symbol of what they were working towards as a scientific director. Eventually, he was managing a team of more than 3,000 individuals. After all his hard work, it finally led up to this. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb explosion took place in the New Mexico desert. When Jeremy Bernstein, another prominent scientist, asked Frank what his brother Robert's first words were after the test had been, the answer was, "I guess it worked." The success of the test led to the devastating destruction of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki the following month. This would go on to cause Robert great shame. He felt compelled to make the bomb for his country, but couldn't bear the idea that he had built something that caused the deaths of so many. No one will ever know for certain how many died as a result of the attack on Hiroshima. Some 70,000 people probably died as a result of the initial blast, heat, and radiation effects. This includes about 20 American airmen. By the end of 1945, because of the lingering effects of radioactive fallout and other after effects, the Hiroshima death toll was probably over 100,000. The 5-year death total may have been reached or even exceeded 200,000, as cancer and other long-term effects took hold. As with the estimates of deaths at Hiroshima, it will never be known for certain how many people died as a result of the atomic attack on Nagasaki. The best estimate is 40,000 people died initially, with 60,000 more injured. By January 1946, the number of deaths probably approached 70,000, with perhaps ultimately twice that number dead total within 5 years. Numerous prominent quotes came from Robert about the atomic bomb detonations, and I'll be sharing with you 2 of these and focusing primarily on one. The first and more well known is this one.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad-Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
This is a very powerful quote, and I love this interview. You can see the sadness and shame in his eyes as he relives the experience in his head. In the year 2000, a history professor from Massachusetts named James A. Hajita wrote a paper explaining what he perceived the quote to mean, and I'm inclined to agree with his analysis. Vishnu wants to convince the prince that he must go to war, something that he refuses because it would involve killing his own relatives and friends. But Vishnu convinces him that he cannot shun that duty greater than he. It is his obligation, and it is not in his hand to choose. In the end, the prince goes to war. If you're interested enough to still be watching this, I highly recommend you watch this video that breaks down the body language in the video of Robert quoting that. The other cool quote I wanted to share was also from Bhagavad-Gita. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One. Both of these quotes were things that Robert said when asked about his initial thoughts when the Trinity test happened and the following, nuclear blast that happened that killed a couple 100,000 people. I felt it was important to share primarily the one about Vishnu because I feel like it helps paint the philosophy and moral compass that Robert was starting to dig into. The post-war stuff gets really convoluted, and a lot of noteworthy things happen, but more or less it's all centered around the same topic. So to keep this video from being way too long, I'm just going to run down what I consider important. In October 1945, Robert was granted an interview with President Harry S. Truman. The meeting went badly after Robert said he felt he had blood on his hands. The remark infuriated Truman and put an end to the meeting. Truman later told his Undersecretary of State, Dean Acheson, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again." Sometime after the war, Robert began serving as chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. For simplicity's sake, I'll be calling the General Advisory Committee advisors and the Atomic Energy Commission the Commission. The Commission was created in 1946 to manage literally everything related to atomic energy for military and civilian applications. The advisors were a group of, advisors. They often had a lot of influence. While the advice given was considered, it was not always heeded. From the position of chairman, Robert advised on a number of nuclear-related issues, including project funding, laboratory construction, and even internal policy. He also lobbied vigorously for international arms control and attempted to influence policy away from a heated arms race. That's going to be a reoccurring theme that you notice from here on forward. As a member of the Board of Consultants to a committee appointed by Truman, Robert strongly influenced a report that advocated the creation of an International Atomic Development Authority, which would essentially own all fissionable material and the means of its productions, such as mines, laboratories, and atomic power plants. It could be used for peaceful energy production, which was essentially Robert's goal. This report resulted in the Borak Plan of 1946, which introduced many additional provisions regarding enforcement. In particular, this required inspection of the Soviet Union's uranium resources. The Soviets saw it as an attempt to maintain the United States' nuclear monopoly and rejected it. With this, it became clear to Robert that an arms race was unavoidable. The first atomic bomb test by the Soviet Union, which happened in August of 1949, came earlier than Americans expected, and over the next several months there was an intense debate within the U.S. government, military, and scientific communities over whether to proceed with the development of the far more powerful hydrogen bomb, then known as the Super. Immediately following the end of the war, Robert and some of the other advisors argued against continuing work on the Super at the time due to both the lack of the need and the fact that there was no feasible design. He and the other advisor opponents were motivated partly by ethical concerns, feeling that such a weapon could only result in millions of deaths. A majority of the commission subsequently endorsed the advisor's recommendation. Robert thought that the fight against the Super would triumph, but proponents of the weapon lobbied the White House vigorously. On January 31, 1950, Truman, who was predisposed to proceed with the development of the weapon anyways, made the formal decision to do so. In 1951, a new design seemed technically feasible, and Robert officially signed on to work under Edward Teller on the Super's development. While still looking for ways in which this testing or development could be questioned, before we continue, it's important to consider the culture of the 1950s and McCarthyism. McCarthyism was the practice of making false or unfounded accusations of subversion and treason, especially when related to anarchism, communism, and socialism, and especially when done in a public and attention-grabbing manner. For reasons that have not been made clear, in 1942, Robert initiated discussions with military security agents that culminated with the implication that some of his friends and acquaintances were actually agents of the Soviet government. This led to the dismissal of a personal friend on the faculty at the University of California, which he later described his contributions to as a tissue of lies. This all came to a head in the 1950s, when Robert's loyalty was questioned. There are two key figures worth mentioning here: the previously mentioned Edward Teller and Louis Strauss. Edward Teller was a fellow scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project, who was also the main driving force behind the development of the Super, the first hydrogen bomb I also mentioned earlier. Louis Strauss was a businessman, philanthropist, and naval officer who served 2 terms on the commission. Most importantly, he was a man who deeply hated Robert. This was for a myriad of reasons, most of which I'll go over. Firstly, Strauss was a conservative Republican, and had little in common with Robert, a liberal who had communist associations. Secondly, he felt that Robert abandoned his Jewish heritage, whereas Strauss had fought to become successful in the anti-Semitic environment of Washington due to the fact that he maintained his prominent roles in the Jewish community. Next, Robert mocked and humiliated Strauss in front of their peers on more than one occasion, and Congress on at least one. Lastly, Strauss knew of Robert's scandalous affairs and was deeply offended by it. In 1953, President Eisenhower named Strauss the Presidential Atomic Energy Advisor and the chairman of the commission. When Eisenhower offered Strauss the commission, Strauss named one condition: Robert would be excluded from all classified atomic work. Strauss had connections with FBI Director Hoover and convinced him to open a formal investigation into Robert's loyalty to the United States. They began to look into every piece of his life, current and past. They even bugged Robert's home and office and read his meeting transcripts. On December 21st, 1953, he was notified of a military security report unfavorable to him and was officially accused of having associated with communists in the past, of delaying the naming of Soviet agents, of constantly opposing the building of the hydrogen bomb, and finally, treason.
It's treason, then.
The main driving force behind this was obviously Strauss. Edward Teller participated in the security hearings as the only major scientist to testify against Robert. This essentially led to him being excommunicated from the physics community and some other science communities. Teller told the FBI that Robert's opposition to the super had delayed the project's progress, despite the fact that other notable scientists on the project had also opposed its development. Many top scientists, as well as government officials, did testify on Robert's behalf. From what I've been able to gather, Robert did not do well during the hearing. There were inconsistencies in his testimony, and I've found other claims that he acted erratically and, quote, made a fool of himself. A security hearing declared him not guilty of treason, but ruled that he should not have access to military secrets. As a result, his contract as advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission was canceled. The Federation of American Scientists immediately came to his defense with a protest against the trial. He was cemented as a hero in the scientific community, and was considered the victim of a witch hunt. It's said this event mentally broke Robert in a way that he was never quite the same again. Robert held the academic post of Director of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University from 1947 to his retirement in 1966. In 1963, LBJ presented Robert with the Enrico Fermi Award of the Atomic Energy Commission. Sadly, Julius Robert Oppenheimer died of throat cancer on February 18, 1967. In 2014, 60 years after the proceedings that effectively ended his career, the Department of Energy released the full declassified transcript of the hearing. While many of the details were already known, the newly released material bolstered Robert's assertions of loyalty and reinforced the perception that a brilliant scientist had been brought low by a bureaucratic cocktail of professional jealousy and McCarthyism. Robert was nominated for the Nobel Prize 3 times, once in 1946, once in 1951, and once in 1967. He never won though, which to be honest really sucks. I find the whole story really sad, because you have a man who gave his entire life to his country, just to have them turn their back on him. You can tell in some of the interviews he did, specifically the Destroyer of the Worlds one, how disheartened he is when he speaks of his obligations. All he wanted was to prevent any more destruction. This man did his duty despite his moral objections. In return, he had his credibility destroyed, got fired, and was accused of being a traitor, all because he wanted the world to tread cautiously in regards to a power that could be used to kill millions, wipe out entire civilizations, and destroy entire cultures. Well guys, that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe. I'm sorry the quality on this one's kinda poor. I've been going through a rough time this past year, and I haven't had as much time to, put into my hobby, and right now my setup's kinda torn apart, so I'm just making do with what I got. Anyways, moving forward, I should probably be moving back towards video games. I really just wanted to jump over and do this history thing for this video because that Oppenheimer movie's coming out. I really just wanted to give my 2 cents before the movie comes out because I figured it might be cool to reflect on it and see how accurate what the movie depicts is. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one.